Hello family, how you doing? This is Lead Professor Q at your service. Today we're going to go over project chartering in our contemporary project management book. So without further ado, you guys know what time it is. It's time for instruction. Hello students, how you doing? This is Lead Professor Q. Today we're going to be talking about, we're going to cover chapter 3, chartering projects in our contemporary project management, plan-driven and agile approaches book, 5th edition. So some of the topics that we're going to cover in this chapter, we're going to discuss, what is a project charter? Why is a project charter used? What is a charter need? The typical elements in a project charter, constructing a project charter, ratifying project charter, PMBOK guide, 7th edition, agile projects and charters, and we'll just do an overall summary at the end. So let's go ahead and discuss what is a project charter. We're going to cover charter testimonial, project charter definition, and cover where a charter falls upon within the project management lifecycle. So what is a project charter? Project charter is an informal contract between the project team and the sponsor. A project charter is an informal contract between the project team and the sponsor. The project charter basically is a deliverable that grants a project manager the right to continue to work on a more detailed planning phase of a project. This may include only permission to plan the project, permission to make decisions that would slow the project if delayed, such as ordering along lead materials or hiring special workers, or permission to plan and perform the entire project in case of a small and simple project. The project charter is that basically what it is. It's a formal contract. It's entered freely by two or more parties. It cannot arbitrarily be changed. It offers some of value for each party, and is a living document that can evolve with changing conditions. And right here, if you take a look at the project management lifecycle, initiation, planning, executing, closing, you'll see that the charter falls within initiating and planning. And signing a charter represents just a transition from initiating to the planning phase. So, why is a project charter used? We're going to cover 4 purposes of a charter: charter organization, authorization, and common understanding. So, for purposes of a charter, 4 purposes of a charter. 1 is to authorize the project manager to proceed. 2 is to help the project manager, sponsor, and team members, if any are already assigned, develop a common understanding of the project. Number 3 purpose is to help the project manager, sponsor, and team members commit to the spirit of the project. And finally, 4 is quickly screen out obvious poor objects. Remember, everyone, the charter helps all project stakeholders. Charters are publicly disclosed to many individuals beyond the project team and the sponsor for communication purposes. Company culture differs with regard to the characteristics such as task or people orientation, competitiveness, work ethics, and attention to detail. Therefore, charters are used in different industries, and companies have somewhat of a different elements or format. So no charter is the same based off the organization that you work for or the PMO that it falls under. So let's talk about authorize the project manager to proceed. In a project charter, the project charter authorizes a commitment of resources to a project. The project charter provides official status within a parent organization. Listen, I worked in project management for over a decade. Typically, you have to have a project charter. That's the official document that makes it, it validates a project in general. So, common understandings: teamwork develops during project charter. The charter agreement, trust, and communication commitment develop. The project team does not worry if the management will accept the decision. Then ultimately the sponsor is less likely to change the original agreement. So, these are some of the benefits and some of the things that happen when you have a project charter developed and in place. So let's go ahead and discuss, when is a project charter needed? So we have what's called a project charter decision matrix that we'll quickly cover. Some of the typical elements in a project charter, the title, scope, overview, business case, background, milestone, schedule, acceptance criteria, risk, assumptions, constraints, resource estimates, stakeholder list, team operating principles, lessons learned, and signature and commitment. Right here is just an exhibit of some of the charter elements and questions answered. Each one of those charter elements, they basically answer the question of a what, why, how much, who, and how. So the title is pretty much basic. It's a unique and meaningful project title. It's critical. The title reflects key characteristics of a project. For example, location, type, name, or technology. So let's talk about the scope overview. When we're dealing with the scope overview, there's three things that are typically covered. They're used to help prevent scope creep. They're considered to be project boundaries, and the quantifying the scope helps with understanding the project size. Always know that the scope overview is a high-level description of what and how. The scope overview is the project in a nutshell. So these two terms right here, product scope, characteristics, features, and functions of what is being created. Know that. Scope creep. Know this. Uncontrolled expansion of what was agreed upon. So this is an example of that is like, one of my project management courses, right? We're talking about project management related processes and learning content. If we start adding in Python or Java coding techniques in this class, that is what you would call a classic example of scope creep regarding this particular class. So let's talk about this business case. In this business case, just definitely notice you're going to every project charter has to have a business case. So these are the things that encompass a business case. It's the project purpose or justification statement. The answer, basically a business case answers the question why. It's used to justify the necessity of the project, ties the project to the organization's strategy, and provides a rationale or high-level cost-benefit estimates. It also persuades and inspires decision makers and team members. Know this. Let's talk about the background. This is used to provide more details to support the scope statement and business case statement. The background statement is ultimately optional. Let's talk about what we call milestone schedule with acceptance criteria. Okay. A milestone schedule is a summary level project schedule composed of major milestones and or completion of deliverables. Acceptance criteria, and this is what you'll see mainly in Agile related projects. Acceptance criteria markers against which deliverables can be evaluated for completeness and correctness. So I bet you guys are asking, what exactly is a milestone? So basically what a milestone is a stone. It's an action or event marking a significant change or stage in development. So if we just look at it from a human conditioning standpoint, and we're going to go into what milestones are later on in this class, but in this thing that we call life, a milestone event in our lives may be, turning 18 or turning 21, or buying your own home, or buying your first car, or getting married. That would be considered a milestone. Let's keep it moving. Next one we want to cover is risk, assumptions, and constraints. A risk, know this, there's a whole chapter on risk in this book, but a risk is an uncertain situation which could have a negative or positive effect on the project if it occurs. Now that's an if it occurs. And assumptions, suppositions made during a project planning that are treated as factual, though they've not been proven. Then we have a constraint. Anything that limits project implementation. This reminders of what could be, risk or reminders of what could prevent successful completion of a project. Also a constraint is something that limits money, time, and resource as a risk. Know something about an assumption, right? A false assumption could become a risk. And we'll cover this more in our risk management chapter later on during the course. So let's talk about risk again. In a project charter, you want to identify, high level negative risk and a plan to overcome it. A positive risk can be considered an opportunity, something you can plan to capitalize on. Consider the risk of not undertaking the project. Then ultimately you assign an owner or responsibility for any negative risk. That is identified, of course. We have what's called resource estimates, a preliminary budget with level of confidence in the estimate. You have to identify expenses the project manager can authorize, and then ultimately you have to identify expenses the sponsor needs to control. We have what's called a stakeholder list in a project charter. Stakeholder list is, what you want to do is identify the stakeholders first. Then with the stakeholders, once you have the stakeholders identified, you have to ask a question, what does each stakeholder care about? And finally, you have to ask, who are the key stakeholders? You want to make sure that these questions are answered when moving forward with a project charter. We have what's called team operating principles. The purpose of a team operating principles is to 1, enhance team functioning, 2, increase team effectiveness, and 3, ensure all parties are aware of what is expected. Some examples of team operating principles are how to conduct meetings, how to treat each other with respect, how to accomplish work, how to make decisions. These are things that you probably definitely want to think about and maybe display in your project charter. I don't see this much, but I see value in doing this, especially with a team of maybe 20 to 30, 20 to 40 people. We have what's called lessons learned. Now, what are lessons learned? Basically, they're knowledge gained from one project which can be applicable to similar future projects. We have what's called a lessons learned register. It's an accumulation of knowledge learned, which can easily be referenced and cataloged. basically, when you're dealing with the lessons learned, their successes and failures of previous projects, and ultimately they become practical advice. They help avoid the risk of repeating mistakes from previous projects. We have what's called signatures and commitment. When we're dealing with signatures and commitment, we have to ask the question, who is involved? We have to understand the extent to which each person can make decisions. Expected time commitment for each person has to be considered. Also, the project sponsor, the project manager, and the core team members show commitment by signing the project charter at the end of the day. Now, constructing a project charter. These are some of the things that we're going to cover in this section of the chapter. There's a scope overview and business case instructions, background instructions, milestone schedule for acceptance criteria instructions, uncertainty instructions, resources needed instructions, stakeholder list instructions, team operating principle instructions, lesson learned instructions, and signature and commitment instructions. So where do we begin? The sponsor creates the first draft of a scope overview and business case. Leadership teams may contribute additional information during this process of chartering. A scope overview and business case should be 1 to 4 sentences each. Sometimes, usually for an important project, the organization's leadership team may even draft other critical aspects of the project beyond just the business case and the scope overview. So, here are the 6 basic steps in constructing what we call a milestone schedule. Now, remember, everybody, what is a milestone? Now, I'm going to say it again. It's an action or event marker marking a significant change or stage in development. So, when we take a look at these 6 steps, the first step is to describe the current situation that requires the project, describe the project at its successful completion. You have to describe the acceptance criteria for the final project deliverables. You have to determine the few key points in the milestone column where quality needs to be verified. For each milestone, you have to determine who the primary stakeholders are and how the resulting deliverable will be judged. And finally, we have to determine the expected completion dates for each milestone. So when dealing with the charter, we want to deal with uncertainty instructions, right? So project managers should look at risk, uncertainty, for 3 reasons. First reason is all negative risks that may exhibit success project completion must be identified. A positive risk, which you talked about earlier, it's an opportunity to complete the project better, faster, and lower cost. Should be benefited from whenever possible. Then finally, sometimes there is more risk to the organization for not doing the project, which provides additional rationale for doing the project. Listen, students, either the project manager or the team members can then act as a facilitator and access one risk at a time. Here's an example. First, you have to ask how likely the risk event is to occur. You have to only after this is answered, ask how big the impact will be if it happens. So let's talk about risk, assumptions, and constraints instructions. So first, when we're dealing with risk, you have to brainstorm all the risks, right? To the schedule, budget, the usefulness, the satisfaction. In my classes, I always put an emphasis on time, cost, and scope. Definitely want to consider all the risks for those 3 areas as well. We have to identify and document assumptions, right? We have to quantify risk based on what? The probability of occurring and the impact if realized. Which risk should be considered what we call major? We have to ask ourselves that question. And then once we identify those major risks, we have to require a formal response plan. The other more minor risks are not formally considered further in the charter, but they very well may get more attention in the planning and execution stages. This is the process of what we call qualitative risk analysis, which we will cover later. Team operating principles and instructions. How do we establish these? Meetings will be conducted, decisions will be made, and ultimately work gets done. Everyone will treat each other with respect. That's important for any project team or anybody that you're dealing with in life. So, lesson learned instructions. First, we have to consider what has worked and not worked. Copy or tailor what was worked. You have to avoid what has not worked. Report lessons learned more than once over a life of a project. Before undertaking project, at key reviews and upon project completion. And ultimately want to make the lessons available in what we call a knowledge base. Project lessons learned example. So these are just some examples. Like you want to consider all parties are responsible for defining the following project scope to avoid what we call scope creep. Another thing that we want to consider is that all parties should share good and bad previous experiences. Aligning team roles to sponsor expectations is critical. You have to keep the sponsor informed so sponsors stay committed. You have to identify any possible changes as soon as possible. You have to use weekly updates on project progress to avoid pleasant schedule surprises. And then we have to review previous events for specific lessons. Always remember, when starting a new project, a project manager and team need to consider what was worked well and what was worked poorly in what we call previous projects. So let's go ahead and discuss ratifying the project charter. It's an overview. It's a 6-step guide, and then you have what we call negotiations. So ratifying the project charter. Just know that you have to present the project charter to the sponsor for approval. The sponsor asks questions for clarification and agreement. Then finally, the sponsor, project manager, and the core team sign the project charter. The project manager and the team informally present the project charter to the sponsor for approval. In some organizations, the leadership team is also present for this particular meeting. Let's talk about this 6-step guide, right? Step 1 is advanced fact finding to determine the desired outcome of negotiation. The step 2 is for the project manager to understand what the minimum acceptable result is. Step 3 is for the project manager to understand the underlying requirements of the sponsor and to share his or her own needs. Step 4 is for both parties to use that understanding what the other really needs to explore various creative solutions that might be acceptable to both. Step 5 consists of the process of strategies of negotiation itself. And finally, we have step 6 is a reminder to reach an agreement and then to document that agreement. And with that, step 6 is actually a reminder to reach that agreement and make sure that it's signed and agreed upon, so there's no hiccups later on down the line in the project. So negotiations. 3 bullet points for here. First, negotiations are pervasive to project management. Negotiations are one way in which conflicts are managed and resolved. And finally, negotiations often determine the extent of success or failure for any project. One must remember that negotiations are a vital part of project management. It happens often and all the time with every aspect of a project. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that PMBOK Guide 7th edition. We're just going to cover some just general terms. I would be remiss not to go ahead and review the PMBOK. It's just some general terms when dealing with the project charter. We had the stakeholders, we had the teams, we had the development approach and life cycle, we had the planning, and then they had the measurement, then we have uncertainty, right? Charters may be impacted by several positions of the PMBOK Guide 7th edition. Depending on the format being used for charters, some of these points may be captured directly in a good project charter, while others may at least influence the thinking and the discussion as the charter is actually being developed. So let's just talk about stakeholders. As a primary purpose of creating a charter is to engage proactively and align with your customer by understanding what the vision for the project is and what the outcomes they are trying to obtain. The chartering process ideally starts a two-way communication between the project team and the key stakeholders. The project team and the stakeholders begin to develop productive working relationships and reach agreement on objectives and enhance the stakeholder satisfaction. The team, when dealing with the project charter. The charter is a good tool to begin team development by leaders sharing a project vision and objectives and beginning to create an environment that encourages team members to work collaboratively. Team roles and methods may be enumerated in a project charter or in an associated team charter. These conversations started in the act of charting set the stage for what we call transparency and ultimately trust. Development approach and life cycle. Charters are used to show an overall project plan at a high level and gain commitment and understanding from, or at least, the sponsor, the project manager, and the team, but may also key stakeholders. The charter should indicate the development approach to be taken, whether it is predictive, hybrid, or either iterative or incremental fashion, or what we call adaptive, aka the term Agile. The true development approach will largely depend on the project type and uncertainty associated with the requirements. And ultimately, whatever the approach, each project phase should show what we call exit criteria, which we'll cover later on in this course. So when we talk about planning, right? Project teams should plan enough to meet the stakeholders' expectations, but no more. The predictive projects may have clearly stated the acceptance criteria in the charter of the ending delivery of each phase. Then finally, adaptive projects may have definition of done for the first iteration or delivery or early delivery, and a roadmap or epics describing the ongoing project direction. Please note that often milestones are identified and included in the charter planning as well. Measurement. 2 bullet points right here. A charter may include both the high-level plan of what is expected to be done at various times and the indicators to judge what we call progress. Ultimately, charters may ideally include a few metrics that are SMART, specific, meaningful, achievable, relevant, and timely. That is what the SMART acronym represents. To enable teams to understand what they need to develop, assure stakeholders that progress is satisfactory, and enable both to predict the future project results. So let's deal and talk about uncertainty, right? Projects need to consider and manage uncertainty, ambiguity, complexity, volatility, and risk. They may handle ambiguity by progressive elaboration and prototypes. Teams deal with threats, negative risk by avoidance, escalation, transfer, mitigation, or acceptance, and with opportunity, positive risk by exploiting the escalating, sharing, and enhancing or accepting. Please note, teams may consider alternative approaches to combat uncertainty and volatility. This is something to think about. Now, let's go ahead and talk about Agile projects and charters. We have what's called the Agile terms used in chartering projects. Then we have, we'll just go over Agile again real quick. Right here, I'm not going to go over in detail this exhibit, but it's a good chart to review to do a comparison of plan-driven and agile approaches for project chartering. It kind of gives you the differences with each one of the project chartering questions of plan-driven, saying it's another word for waterfall. Then we have agile. Keep this in mind. Please note that the chartering process in agile environments is similar to and differs from the traditional project selection method discussed thus far. So, please note we're pivoting to agile, right? Agile terms used in project chartering. We have the commitment to work, the time box, the product vision. We have what's called the sprint. We have what we call deferred decisions, sustainable pace, commitment, definition of done, shareable knowledge. All these terms are important, but please know if I'm being introduced to the Agile methodology, the must-know terms are sprints, aka iteration. It's a short period that when a team commits to creating a specific deliverable. Know what a commitment is, and what basically a team's follow through, only taking on tasks they can do. Then please know the definition of done. An agreement on exactly what the product owner, PO, will judge the deliverables produced. Please know, out of all the terms here, know those three terms. Those are used often. Then we have what's called Agile, right? Agile projects, Agile when it comes to project charter. Agile projects adopt an informal approach rather than a formal project charter. An Agile charter, after the first milestone, is a general roadmap of the product. One key idea of Agile projects is to make decisions at the latest responsible moment so that more complete information can be used in the decision. Then finally, Agile projects begin with the approval by the product owner for the team to start the ultimate project. Two takeaways. Rather than have a defined set of milestones, an Agile charter after the first milestone is more of a general roadmap of the product. And number two, subsequent milestones and definitions of done are determined on a just-in-time basis, which we'll cover what specifically just-in-time is later on in this course. All right, students, that is it for Chapter 3, Chartering Projects. If you have any questions or feedback, please email me or put something in the comment field, and I'll get back with you as soon as possible. You guys have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.